Hi, my name's Erik Weaver. I work for Western Digital in the Media and Entertainment Division, and I have the privilege today of having Linda Tadic here to interview from Digital Bedrock. Hi, Linda. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Digital Bedrock is a managed digital preservation service, and what that means is we do all of the work for our clients. They just have to provide the files to us, and we take care of all that complex preservation work that's required, not just the storage part, but all of the actions that you must do to keep your content alive if you want to be able to use it in the future.
Oh, cool. So they just drop off what, a tape or a drive or?
Well, what they do right now, we are accepting tape or drives, but what we also have is a package tool that we call, and so they use that to select their files. It dedupes it because why should somebody to pay to preserve something twice or 3 or 4 times? Even if they've renamed the file, it'll catch it or put it in another folder. It will then package it up with SHA-512 checksums, even at the frame level. So that's why we require that they first use this tool to select the files, because the tool then does a lot of the pre-ingest work that we then need when we ingest the content into our system. And so right now it's hard delivery, because that's pretty much what everybody has been saying they actually prefer doing. You know, on just media, it's faster. They feel it's actually more secure. But I know that we'll eventually get into more like a Sparrow-based or some other system to bring the data in. Because we're in a really strong high-security data center in downtown Los Angeles with like a 10 gig connection. And so it's eventually we'll get to that point. But right now it's all media delivery.
Excellent, excellent. So you've been heard saying that preservation's more than just storage. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure, and so I think that's what I was mentioning earlier about Digital Bedrock, about what we do is so like the storage is actually the easy part of it all. It's all of that work you have to do to keep the content alive. I mean, the most basic thing you do, which is what most places would do, is like they at least want to put their files or their content, digital content, stored somewhere. The bits have to live somewhere, and whether it's on spinning disk or tape. And you know, if it's in the cloud, that's going to be spinning disk or solid state or whatever. It's still physical media. It's sitting on something. It's physical. So that's easy. And so most people are just doing, all right, they have that. They're maybe doing checksums or fixity checks, you know, on the hash that's being created, maybe. They might have redundancy. Most places, I imagine, would have at least 2 copies of something, if not 3, you know, spread across, and a variety of different storage media. So again, that's like the basic, you know, actions that most places would want to do or aspire to do if they're not already doing it. But then the complicated thing is once those files are sitting there, you have to make sure, like, okay, so what is that file? You know, and I'm not talking about the content of it, because usually places would have some kind of collection management system or a database or something where they know, like, yeah, this file is this particular title or version or whatever. But it's all of the data about the characteristics of how was that file created? How was that content created? What are the relationships between the files? Because if you want to preserve one of those streams within a container, for example, you want to know that, okay, within that container, that file inside of that video file might be becoming obsolete or it's no longer supported, or there's yet a new bright, shiny format that people should be using. But then if you change that, then the other files that it's looking for, it can't find it. And so then you pretty much might have destroyed an actual renderable product because you've changed one part of it. So you have to be careful. So that's why you need to know, how are these files created, what's required to keep them alive, what software dependencies are involved in being able to play that content, and the software then requires operating systems or maybe a file system. So you need to monitor all that metadata about those objects in order to be able to preserve them in the future, because you might need to then transcode them or migrate the content. You're going to be migrating it off media no matter what. I mean, that's just the name of the game until some store and ignore, you know, long-term storage medium is discovered. There's just no way around that. And so that's a given. It's migrating the content and monitoring it and making sure it's still okay over time.
Are there any formalized standards on some of those wrappers possibly, or how you're packaging that up?
Well, SMPTE has developed a standard, the AXF standard, Archival Exchange Format, and so that right now is like the a format that people are looking to be able to package up, you know, here's your essence files, here's all the related files that go along in order to preserve this object. So that's kind of like an object-based container, so all the files around it are within AXF, so then you can move it from one system to another and it's self-describing within the format. That's very helpful. There's a standard coming out of Library of Congress called AS07, which is another MXF container flavor. There's IMF, of course, or IMP, and that's all for delivery, though, not for archival. And so since I'm an archivist, I'm looking more towards archival. Of course, although we also preserve DCPs and more mezzanine and intermediate formats as well, because that's important to keep. But it's like, what's that master that you want to keep forever to use? And then, so those are formats. And then there's also thinking again along the lines of container, and then there's the storage, which is like object storage, which is a type of container, even though it isn't like file-based, like AXF or AS7 or like IMF or IMP, but it's still a way of being able to keep related files all together, at least in a storage environment. So those are the 3, 4 kinds of ways of how people are trying to bundle things together, in order to keep them related, to move them into the future.
It was funny, I almost got stumped once somebody asked, well, can you do an IMF package in an AXF format? I had to look it up, and yes, you can. But
yes.
Anyways, you talked about containers a few minutes ago. Tell me more about this, because this is something that we've been very interested in, or some of the work that I've looked at in the past.
Well, I think, in thinking about, and especially because this interview is taking place during SEMTI, during the Hollywood Technical Conference, and so there's been a lot of talk this week about how do you bundle up things, but then which is great again because you want to keep all those files together. But once you have those files together, whether it's in a container format like AXF or whether it's an object storage, that's immutable. You can't change it. And so the problem with that, so that's a good thing, but the problem with that is that then what if there's data or things you want to do to again, explain or add data to the files that are inside that object, whether it's AXF again or just storage? Where do you retain that data? Because you're going to be ideally, the whole point of preservation is because you want to use it in the future. And if you want to use it in the future, then there's going to be data, even if the object itself is immutable, the metadata is mutable, it's active. And so it's going to keep changing, or you want to keep adding to it. And so and I'm sure like anything, it can be worked out. But right now, the only way to manage, that added metadata, the mutable metadata about the objects inside it, is to keep that data outside of the object. Or of course, you open up that object and you create a whole new one, and then that gets to be it just adds more trouble to managing the assets. Mm-hmm.
I often people get confused with the concept of archive versus backup. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, because it's all metadata, it's all semantics. It's like, what are you talking about when you talk about archiving? Yeah. So if you talk to an IT professional, a network person, they're going to say, yeah, we archive it, we're doing archiving. But if you talk to a preservationist or an archivist, they're saying, no, all you're doing is backing up the files. And so oftentimes you'll see, like when people are starting to talk together and trying to communicate, that's one of the first terms they have to make sure that they understand the definition of it, that they're referring to the same thing. Because archiving is which is, again, it's the first step of preservation, or it was like you want to back it up. You have redundancy, but then you have to think about, well, how are you backing that up? Is it if it's, on tape or in a spinning disk for that matter, what's the file system that's on that device? Because what I tell people, and here I am like a service provider, but I also tell people is like, before you even think about how you're going to store your data, whether it's in the cloud or you're using a vendor or whatever, think about the end game is you're going to be getting your data out of that system, off of that physical medium or out of that vendor or whatever. How easy is it for you to get your data out of that environment to put it into another one? Because it's guaranteed you're going to do that at some point in the history of those assets. Maybe after you've retired and gone on, but somebody's going to be doing it in the future. Mm-hmm. So the first thing you want to do is plan, how to organize that data so that it will be easy to migrate it out of one system to another, and in the most cost-effective way possible. Because a lot of people who use cloud vendors, they put it all up there and it's very convenient, wonderful. They can access it, but then if they ever want to get it out, that's where the cost comes in. Not just the cost, but then the management. Okay, you're going to move it from here, you're going to move it to there. How easy it's to do that, how expensive is that going to be?
I've heard some horror stories around that in the past.
Yes.
So you're a metadata guru is what I hear, and I love metadata. It's really sad. Sorry. But any pointers on metadata and things we should understand about metadata?
Boy, again, one of the takeaways from SEMTI from this week is like the thing is when you go digital, you just have a whole lot more metadata you have to worry about. And so we need to automate that metadata, which was one of the topics, underlying themes I kept hearing, in the past couple of days, because especially as we're getting into immersive environments, virtual reality, you have all these files that, again, they have to interrelate to each other. And people are just so caught up in, okay, what's the technology we can use or appropriate from gaming, which is also really interesting that they're doing that. But they're, again, per usual, because people aren't thinking about the future, they're thinking about what can we do now?
Yeah.
And they're not thinking, all right, so I'm going to create this. What do I need to save in order to be able to recreate that or render it or preserve it in the future? And that's a lot of metadata. And so it's a lot of, again, going back to the beginning, it's like, what's that technical metadata? What are the characteristics of that file? How do they all relate to each other? What's the environment that's required? And so you want to try to be able to extract that metadata, because it will be very difficult to get somebody, or make it automated. It's going to be difficult to get some poor person sitting there at the very beginning of a production and say, yeah, this is a file that we need to save, and these are its characteristics, and they're going to sit there and typing, and it's like, really? I don't think so. So you need to be able to automate it. Exactly, and then less human error there too, because it's coming off a machine. It's coming off the file itself. The file is describing it.
So that's kind of a perfect segue for one of my last questions here. You talked about what's exciting this week right now. What do you see coming in the next year beyond that? What's really exciting you?
I think that we're going to be seeing more tools out there to automate these processes and automate metadata. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And so that people then can search for specific metadata about the files without having to have a human being sit there and type it in. I think, though, that one of the things that I am hoping it's just going to have to happen, because as so much data is being created and people are concerned about storage and all the costs around storage and the management and et cetera, they need to stop saving everything. And so I think that one of the things that has to happen is more at the human level, which is like to do an appraisal and retention policy, within an entity. When they start producing or creating something, they have to decide then, this is what's important for us to save and keep. And that can be part of the metadata. It's all the production and process metadata. These files we have to keep. And then these are going to be passed on down the chain, and then these will be retained. These retention policy, they can just be deleted, or put them on offline storage for a long time, and then in 3 years. But then people always say this, they say, yeah, we'll just decide in 5 years if we want to keep it or not. Nobody ever goes back, and thinks about it. So that's why I decide at the beginning, and especially with automation, if you're saying, yeah, in 5 years we're going to delete it, or 3 years, or 1 year, or whatever it is, it's kind of like, criminal evidence, it's only retained for a certain period depending on what the crime was committed. Think about the beginning, what's the retention policy, and have it automated, have a flag come up, okay, this is going to be deleted, take one last look before it's gone.
Yeah.
And just put that into the workflows again, so it's easy for people to do, so that there isn't a barrier or obstacle to make it difficult for them. They have to make things easy so people will actually do it.
Thank you so much for coming today. I really enjoyed interviewing you. Love the topics. Thank everyone for being here today, and hope you learned something good and interesting.